go back to the New York City of the 1970s, back then we were killing police each year in the performance of our duties, 90 people a year. We have transformed the NYPD over that 40-year period of time, where we have some of the lowest, if not lowest, rates of use of force of any police department in the United States. And I think I can successfully predict that as we did in the 70s, we will come out of this better and stronger as we go forward.
And that, of course, Police Commissioner Bratton earlier today talking about the number of police deaths that the city once saw and the comparisons. And I saw Howard Safer, former commissioner, on earlier today. And he said he was really concerned that we could see some of the returns of the 70s, where you may remember the term the flower pots, where police would sit in squad cars and they wouldn't respond. And he used an analogy of a domestic violence case. And if they'd pull up to a scene, they didn't see something going on, they'll just report it that there was nothing there when they came on because of the concern about where we are. Listen, before this tragedy, there was an agreement that there was going to be retraining and that there was going to be a reanalysis of police procedures. This is all happening at the same time the crime rates are at their lowest level. And New York City, I don't think there'd be any debate, is the safest major American city in the country. So you have all these conflicting things going on at the same time. But you also have, as you know, a huge gap, as much as I've seen, and you do polls, Jeannie, between how blacks and whites look at both police and the justice system right now. That happened before the mayor said anything. God forbid what happened this past Saturday. But it was punctuated by those two incidents that happened, obviously in Missouri, and as also that happened in Staten Island. And we'll be talking about Cleveland, and we'll be talking about Brooklyn, I'm sure, in the next few weeks and months as well. Where we are right now, and I'm not trying to date you, Jay, but do you feel overtures of the 70s in terms of not just the friction between the police and, let's say, Gracie Mansion, but where law enforcement is right now in terms of expectations and I guess morale?
Well, morale is down for a number of reasons. The lack of political support, the contract issue you can't ignore when you're considerably paid less than surrounding communities. I don't believe at this point in time that we have wholesale organized attacks on the police as we had in the early 70s, but you're going to have lone wolf people, and I think for at least in the short duration, you're going to reinstitute some of the protective measures that we did in the early 70s. For example, no longer will you have solo foot posts, and that order went out not from the PBA, but from the Chief of Department's office, that when you're on a foot post, you will have a partner, and you will take your meals and breaks together. I think you will also find that police officers responding to jobs in radio cars may be tailed by other police officers to ensure their safety. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, I don't think you're going to see wholesale attacks on the police officers across the country as we had in the early 70s. And that wasn't just New York. It was New York, it was Chicago, it was Los Angeles, it was San Francisco. Mm-hmm. It was across the country. A little different dynamic today.
Scott, you sat in the big chair. And when things went well, it was good. And when things went bad, it came back to you. And it's funny, I've heard from folks in the military to say, you know, I turned my back when the general walked in or whatever. I was going to the break. Or I don't get to say, especially if I'm a city employee, that basically accusing them of murder. And I also don't get to make a policy or advocate for making a policy on the fly as well. I've heard calls, and thankfully the mayor hasn't gone there. He can make an example and fire people so that you can have, in effect, not only dissension in the ranks, but everybody making up their own rules. Where is that line between it's a show of emotion and it's not just disrespect, but it's more than that? Because at the end, you got to have chain of command. You may not like the top of the command, but you got to have chain of command if you're going to have law and order.
Absolutely right. And one of the chief things that a chief executive officer has to have is the ability to move forces. That's basically his army. In any major emergency in New York City or anywhere, he has got to have command and control of the police department, not just the commissioner. It is critical that this mayor begin to do something to amend and change the way the police, the rank and file.
I'm asking you to be the mayor for a second. I've heard two different thoughts. He goes on bended knee and asks the police here, I misspoke in the past, I didn't choose my words, as Jay would say, as carefully as he needed to. Some say that's going to show weakness when he's already been, in effect, slapped around in public. The second thing is he tries to make an example of some of those that publicly, at a time of great tragedy, not just showed disrespect to him, but made a difficult job that much more difficult. Well, would you choose a third way? What would you do?
I would talk less. I would have a private meeting that could be made public with the rank and file and the union leaders. I would sit down with them. That's not weakness. That's showing that this can't go on. If we allow this to go on, if I don't take a leadership position, then I'm at fault. It'll just continue. There's no such thing as backing down here. He's got to go out and he's got to meet with the union officers. He's got to meet with rank and file. I would have a meeting of everybody in a gym. Literally. Let them get the catcalls. Let them respond to the issues. Let them say, we're in this together. You know, the saddest thing, the irony of these there was an Asian and a Latino.
Yeah.
This is not about race. It's about law enforcement. And if he doesn't do that kind of thing, not for the television cameras, not for whether he's going to be, chided one way or the other by those who thinks he shouldn't work with the police. He has got to take a leadership position, both publicly and privately, to meet with the police, get them to understand he's in control.
Dominic, though, you want to talk about this isn't happening in a vacuum. The mayor all but begged here. And it seemed that some of the largest groups are going to stand down here until the funerals and the wake and the funeral are done. No more protests. But once post-Saturday, that anger that's out there, the tens of thousands of people who protested in the streets of New York, and you were there for the thousands that protested at the same time in Washington, the places, they're going to be back out there. There's going to be some idiots who are going to say some horrible stuff like they did before about the cops. What then? And I was a little surprised the mayor made a point of going after a reporter who pressed the issue today.
Well, he should. He should. I mean, some of his advisors will say that he shouldn't go after the media, but the media is stirring this pot. I'm not going to say what newspaper, but you have a war of tabloids where they're fighting to survive, and they're being reckless in the headlines that they're putting out there. They're constantly attacking de Blasio. See, the mayor's walking such a fine line. He has tried to issue, I know it don't sit well, but he has tried to issue an olive branch to the black community. It has worked thus far. There has not been violence up until tragically when the officers were hurt at the rally and this person, whatever, I won't even say his name, that shot the police officers. Up until that point, his strategy was working. It worked. Now, it didn't sit well with the rank and file. But see, here's why I'm confused. So if he's with the black community, then he can't be with the police?
No, that's wrong.
Okay, so I listen to what Pat Lynch said. I listen to what Ed Mullen said. But what he said was a black parent has to tell their child about the realities. Why is that offensive to law enforcement?
The offense to law enforcement is not that he gave his child instructions. We all give our children instructions about various things. You don't necessarily make them public. For example, if you have a daughter that's going off to college and you know she's not old enough to drink, but you don't live in a vacuum. So what do you tell your daughter? You say, look, if you put the drink down and you turn your back and you lose sight of it, don't touch that cup or that glass again. But you don't come up publicly and tell everybody in the world what your private conversations are.
And Richard, you know what the other play? You're right on that. The other play in all of this, we already know. I mean, let's call it what it is and stop ignoring it. Law enforcement don't like the fact that he's with Sharpton. And maybe that's a mistake. I don't know. But Sharpton plays a large role in this, and his safety is at issue right now. If you notice the last 2 days, you haven't really seen much of the Reverend. He claims that he's received some death threats.
He played the cell phone message for the world to hear, but yes. Jeannie, I know we're way over the break here, but my question is, I mentioned how complicated all this was just on the here and now. We then talk about the near future where the protests that are going on nationally are very real. We talk about the poll numbers, about how this is not an issue that's going to go away just because there's a tragedy, unfortunately. Finally, he was elected. He campaigned and was elected, but with a huge majority of the elected public. He's the only elected guy in this whole conversation. And he's going to turn around and say, by more than 2-1, they voted for me to roll back broken windows. So it's not like, I think you mentioned before that he's got this agenda. He was elected on that. And he promised to deliver it if he was elected. So you want to talk about add these levels of complication up to the top.
But let's remember, he was elected in a Democratic primary because the Republicans had no shot in heck of winning. He was elected in a Democratic primary where he had to play to that base, and he did, and rightly so. That's how our system works.
Gene, wait,
I'll
let you finish.
You will not. You'll cut me off.
I can't let you pretend
Oh,
that the
absolutely.
polls don't say that the vast majority of folks in New York City don't want to roll back some of the community policing.
Well,
every poll says that. You know polls better than I do.
Yeah, but Richard, well, let me just finish. Then in November, he was elected by a turnout the lowest in New York City's history, or almost in the modern history, 20% of the electorate. Here's the problem, and this is what I'm talking about. There's a huge difference between running, being elected, and governing. And you cannot govern the way that you run. It simply doesn't work. And if you're talking about polls, why don't we go back and look at the polls before he won? 70% approval for the NYPD.
Yeah.
That's shot way down. You look at, and I agree with you, there's a divide between black and white on these issues, but even approval of the commissioner and the NYPD was up much further than it is now. Now, I agree that's to do with Garner and things out of the mayor's control, but the problem for the mayor is he has to, number one, govern the city. Everything else has to take a back seat,
No debate,
or he
but-
can't do the initiatives
No
he
debate,
promised.
but to pretend as if he created this fictitious issue about changing the way policing
no,
works,
he absolutely-
like all of a sudden this was some
He
made up agenda.
absolutely
Whether
didn't.
I agree
No,
with it or not,
but-
he ran on that.
But
and he
Richard,
won
let's
on that.
remember, stop and frisk was coming down while he was running. Right? Let's remember that. So, he didn't make up an issue. It was a ripe issue. It's an important issue. He's not going to achieve any of his issues if the NYPD is against
another
him.
issue I have is they're yelling at me to go to break.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay, yes, absolutely. I didn't cut you off, or I tried to, but it didn't
Thank
work.
you, Richard.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a look as to where we go from here. Will there be, where do we go, especially when you got Gurley? The case here ahead as it relates to Akai Gurley. We're going to talk about that and much more in a very complicated chapter in New York history. Stay with us.